Hello, welcome back to another Book Thoughts. We haven't done one of these in a little bit, I don't think, and I just finished a book that I really want to talk about. The book is Broken Earth, The Rural Chinese by Stephen W. Mosher. So what this book is that Mosher was able to go, he's an anthropologist by trade, focuses on China, and he was able through the Carter administration to go and live in China in a southern Chinese rural village before the country was opened up more broadly to academics. It's a very interesting book. It was definitely written in a much more his experience kind of way. This isn't a book about facts and figures and footnotes. This is very much his experience, what he learned on a personal level while in China. So, just so we have an understanding about what this is. That being said, he approaches the massively complicated question of the general experience of the rural Chinese in the late 70s, early 80s, in fantastic detail with a real appreciation for what the actual people said, what the actual individuals and their stories, but at the same time talking to enough people to get a broad base. This was especially a challenge at that time because China had just opened up. I mean, he was literally kicking down the front door. The information control that the Chinese Communist government had back then is no less severe than what they have now. So it's a very interesting book. It doesn't shy away from issues. It talks about decollectivization. So this book doesn't shy away from making opinions and from telling you the opinions. I believe that he does a fairly good job of evidencing his opinions, giving examples and trying to pull in the history of how certain policy choices came to be and certain ideological choices happened. However, I will admit that I am definitely prejudiced because it largely falls in line with my own views on the history of China. Because for this, the 1970s and 80s, that's history to us. But that was his present day. So, from the vantage point of history, I largely agree with many of his points. Not all of them. Not all of them. Some of them, he didn't foresee how China was going to go down the path of capitalism with Chinese characteristics that they did in the 80s, in that reform. He also didn't foresee how student resistance was going to get clamped down on with the Tiananmen massacre in 1989. So we have a lot more information than he had, but it's very interesting because he goes in there and he was skeptical of prior Chinese claims by the government. The Communist Party made claims about this, about that, the other, and I mean, he was obviously skeptical because it was mostly propaganda, but he talks about in here that he didn't realize just how much his thinking had been colored by the propaganda. He wasn't even at a position when he first went to start asking the right questions. So he wasn't getting the interesting answers because he wasn't asking the interesting questions. He also had to come up against the ingrained party line responses. I mean, many of these people that he was talking to had, the Cultural Revolution, where a wrong word could get you beaten, sent to prison, or killed, was just a few years earlier. I mean, it just ended shortly before he went in. So these people were all on guard about everything they said if it was something they were drilled to say. So if he asked about, have you seen progress in agriculture, and they would go, yes, the Communist Party has increased our living standard, da 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 da, and it was like canned responses, because even variation you didn't want to do, because maybe a variation, some party official or some, overzealous, Red Guard back in the worst days of the Cultural Revolution would hear that and call you out, and it would be a problem. But he found that he could get around things like that by asking them instead, what years did you eat best? Because then that was something that they didn't have a pre-canned response for, and then they would end up being more candid. So it is very interesting going through this book, which is both chronologically and topically organized. Even though within the book each chapter is dedicated to a specific topic, there's definitely a progression in there of of the topics he was exposed to, not necessarily in order, but definitely in a roughly chronological flow. So revelations that on the most personal level that he was getting come towards the end. Understanding of how city life in China is. There's a little bit of that in the beginning, but that's where he was whenever he first comes into China. It was in a city, and then he goes out to the country. So it's in the beginning. So the book flows pretty well. I want to warn you, if you go to pick up this book, there are images of a woman having a coerced abortion. There are images of that in the book. I know that he got a lot of issue with that whenever the book was published. So I was reading just a little bit about this guy's background, and apparently he went and was in China, did this, came back, and he was accused in 1981, so I think this book was published in 81, of bribing Chinese officials. And so, because of that, was not allowed back in the country. Could he have done that? Yeah, probably. I mean, that was how he had to get a lot of stuff done. He talks about it in the book. Yeah. Probably what was more important to the Chinese government was keeping him out of the country because they didn't like what he wrote. After he gets back, he was a PhD candidate at Stanford University at the time, and he was expelled shortly after he came back for, quote, lack of candor over his use of data on China. And some people within that world believe that Stanford was under pressure by the Chinese government, and that they had to remove Mosher, or other Stanford scholars wouldn't get to go there. This would be standard MO for how they act nowadays, so I could believe that very much. But like I said, he did also he did also do things like show pictures of a person having an abortion. Which there's some privacy issues there. So, yeah. Take what you will from that. He apparently, the author, post that period, has really gone on to, let's see, what is this? Gone on to make some anti-Chinese Communist Party political policy interest group things. I can't quite tell if it's if it's one that's supposed to like educate, or if it's lobbying, or if they're writing research papers. I can't quite tell just from my cursory glance, but it's good to know an author's biases as you go to read them, for sure. So the man definitely has some anti-Communist Party biases, But I think that if you read this book, most of what he says has in later times been proven true. So not everything, not all of his guesses are on the money, but by and large, he made a lot of educated guesses. Why I think you should read this book is because it gives an excellent glimpse into what average Chinese life was like right before the Chinese with capitalism with Chinese characteristics happens. I think that's invaluable. I think that we often put too much focus on the highly visible folks, the people in the cities, the people that are doing well. We don't think about the poor Chinese. And I mean, even today, I believe the majority of Chinese are peasants. I believe. The last numbers I have on that were like 2008. But at that time, it was still vast majority of the population was peasantry, working on trying to make a living on these tiny patches of land, and yeah, so I think that this book is very good for that. I think that the prose definitely eases everything here because it's very conversational. This is not a hard book to read. It's not a hard book to approach, as opposed to something that was with a more overtly scholastic bent. So this book is a solid recommendation for me. Just no ifs, ands, or buts. Solid recommendation. I think that if you have an interest in China, that it's very important to read. If you have an interest in communist parties, it's important to read. And I think if you have an interest in the differing experiences of poor around the world, remarkable different experiences around the world in that, I think that this is a very good book to read. And neither in that it deals with it very even-handedly. It neither sensationalizes nor covers up. So yeah, that's a full-throated endorsement. Don't know where you're going to find it because it's an old book, but I'm sure you can find it at used bookstores or Amazon or wherever else. So yeah, that's what I have about this book. And who knows when I'm going to do the next one. I don't know. I've been reading a lot of books, but not all of them move me to make one of these videos. Anyway, I'll catch you guys next time. Alright, bye-bye.